Rain cuts across the docks like shrapnel the day we buried my sister, Claire. I was still in uniform, U.S. Navy SEALs insignia covered in mud, when my father, Rear Admiral Thomas Hale, stepped off the pier carrying a small wooden box sealed with naval rope. He didn't salute. He didn't speak. He just threw it into the river and whispered something I couldn't hear. The water swallowed it whole. Then a sound. Muffled. Fragile. Alive. I gripped my badge, instincts kicking in. "No, Dad," I murmured under my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs like artillery fire. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is." The rain was coming down harder now, each drop hitting my face like tiny accusations, and I could feel something breaking inside me, something that had been holding together through years of combat, through missions where death was the enemy, not family. But standing there on that dock, watching my father's broad shoulders disappear into the storm, I knew I was about to discover that the real enemy had been living in my house my entire life. Before I tell you what I found in that water, what I pulled from those dark currents that changed everything I thought I knew about honor and duty and the cost of silence, I need you to understand where this story comes from. I need you to understand the machine that built me, the system that destroyed my sister, and the moment I realized that sometimes the greatest act of service is betrayal. I'm Lieutenant Commander Elena Hale, daughter of a man who believed emotions were for civilians, who taught me that tears were tactical failures and love was a security breach waiting to happen. We were a military dynasty built on 3 generations of service, sacrifice, and silence. My mother ran chaplain programs for grieving families while never acknowledging her own grief. My sister Claire painted watercolors of ships that never sailed, dreaming of horizons my father would never let her reach. And me? I became exactly what he wanted, a weapon with a conscience he could control. Dad taught us 3 laws, hammered them into us like the Pledge of Allegiance: duty before comfort, secrecy before sympathy. The mission always wins. These weren't suggestions in the Hale household, they were commandments carved in military stone, and breaking them wasn't just rebellion, it was treason. Claire never fit that mold. She was all soft edges in a house of sharp corners, all feeling in a family that treated emotions like classified intelligence. While I learned to compartmentalize pain, she wore hers like jewelry. While I mastered the art of tactical silence, she spoke in colors and textures and dreams that had no place in our father's world. When she fell for a civilian journalist investigating defense contracts, my father didn't just disapprove, he declared war. Marcus Rowan was everything our father despised: a truth-teller, a question-asker, a man who believed transparency was more important than tradition. He was writing exposés on military procurement fraud, following paper trails that led to contractors Dad had personally approved. The night Claire brought him home for dinner, I watched my father's face go through every stage of tactical assessment: threat identification, risk evaluation, elimination protocol. By dessert, Marcus was already a target. Dad had him blacklisted within a week. Security clearance revoked. Professional reputation destroyed. Our house turned into an interrogation cell, surveillance cameras in the hallways, curfews that felt like house arrest, loyalty drills disguised as family conversations. Claire's phone was monitored. Her emails were screened. Her art supplies were searched for hidden messages. We were living under martial law, and the enemy was love itself. When Claire confided in me that she was pregnant, I felt my world tilt on its axis. We were sitting in her room, surrounded by her paintings of peaceful harbors and gentle waves, and she placed my hand on her still flat belly with tears streaming down her face. "I'm scared, Elena," she whispered. "Not of having a baby, but of what Dad will do when he finds out." In my world, her pregnancy wasn't family news. It was classified data with implications that could destroy everything our father had built. I wanted to comfort her. I wanted to promise her protection. Instead, I heard myself asking the questions I'd been trained to ask. Does Marcus know? Have you told anyone else? What's your extraction plan? I was treating my sister's joy like an intelligence leak, and the shame of that moment still burns in my chest like shrapnel I can't dig out. 2 weeks later, I got a message through official channels. Lieutenant Hale has been reassigned to recovery leave pending medical evaluation. It was military speak for disgraced and disappeared. When I asked Dad where Claire had gone, he handed me a transfer order with her signature forged at the bottom. She's getting the help she needs, he said, and I knew with sick certainty that help, in our family vocabulary, meant elimination. I tried calling her. Her phone was disconnected. I tried finding her through naval databases. Her records were classified above my clearance level. My own sister had become a ghost, and my father was the one holding the sheet. For 3 months, I followed orders and asked no questions, because that's what good soldiers do. That's what daughters of Rear Admirals do. That's what cowards do when they're too afraid to face the truth about the people they love. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was running drills with my unit. Vehicular accident, the voice on the phone said. Storm conditions. No survivors. Body recovered from the river. No one questioned her accident. The official report was clean, clinical, perfect. Lieutenant Claire Hale suffered vehicular loss under adverse weather conditions while on medical leave. Next of kin notified. Military honors approved. But I knew better. I knew the timing was too convenient, the circumstances too clean. Claire was the most careful driver I'd ever known, and she'd been terrified of storms since childhood. She would never have been out in weather like that unless someone had forced her. Someone like our father, who'd spent 30 years learning how to make problems disappear without leaving fingerprints. At the burial, I noticed my father's hands shaking not with grief, but with guilt. He stood at attention during the service, his jaw locked, his eyes focused on some distant point beyond the horizon. But his hands betrayed him, trembling just enough for me to see the cracks in his perfect military facade. When the chaplain asked if anyone wanted to speak, Dad stepped forward with that small wooden box sealed with naval rope. Claire understood duty, he said to the small gathering of family and naval personnel. She knew that sometimes service requires sacrifice. Then he walked to the edge of the pier and threw the box into the churning water below. The splash was swallowed by the storm, and he whispered something I couldn't hear, words that were carried away by the wind like a confession he couldn't bear to speak aloud. That's when I heard it. A sound from the water. Muffled. Fragile. Alive. A cry that cut through the storm like a distress signal, and I knew with absolute certainty what my father had just tried to bury with my sister's memory. I dove without thinking, my dress blues dragging me down like anchors. The current was vicious, pulling me sideways and under, the cold water shocking my system like electricity. But my SEAL training kicked in, muscle memory overriding panic, and I fought my way to where the box was sinking into the dark water. My fingers closed around the rope just as it was about to disappear, and I hauled it up with strength I didn't know I had. Inside, wrapped in Navy-issue fabric with a hospital tag reading Baby Hale Rowan, was a newborn. Claire's child. My nephew. The secret my father had tried to drown along with the evidence of his crimes. The baby was barely breathing, his tiny lips blue with cold, and as I held him against my chest in that freezing water, I felt something fundamental break inside me. Not my heart, that had shattered months ago when Claire disappeared. What broke was my faith in the institution that had shaped my entire life. I climbed out of the water shaking, not from cold but from rage. My father was waiting on the pier, still standing at attention, the storm raging behind him like a dramatic backdrop for the confrontation I'd been avoiding my entire life. His face was a mask of military composure, but I could see the calculation in his eyes, the same look he'd worn when deciding how to handle Marcus, how to handle Claire, how to handle the inconvenient truth of their love. You don't understand the situation, Lieutenant Commander, he said, using my rank like a weapon. His voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. This matter involves national security considerations beyond your clearance level. Try me, I replied, holding the infant closer as he began to cry. The sound cut through the storm like an air raid siren, a reminder that this wasn't about security or duty or any of the abstract concepts my father used to justify his actions. This was about a helpless child whose only crime was existing. "Your sister compromised operational security," he said flatly, as if he were discussing weather patterns or supply logistics. "Her relationship with that journalist created vulnerabilities in our intelligence network. Her pregnancy represented an ongoing security risk that required immediate mitigation." "She had a child, not a weapon," I shot back, my voice cracking with fury. "She fell in love with a man who told the truth, and you destroyed them both for it. The difference between a child and a weapon," he said with the cold precision of a man who'd spent decades turning people into strategic assets, "is paperwork, documentation, control. Your sister's choices created chaos where we needed order. The child represents a potential intelligence leak with 18 years of operational vulnerability." That's when I knew. Looking into my father's eyes, seeing the absolute absence of remorse or recognition of what he'd done, I realized that his war wasn't against enemies overseas. His war was against vulnerability itself, against the messy human emotions that couldn't be classified or controlled or eliminated with the stroke of a pen. He'd killed my sister not because she was a traitor, but because she was proof that love was stronger than loyalty, that there were some things more important than following orders. "You're talking about your grandson," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the wind. "Your daughter's child. Your own blood." "I'm talking about a security risk," he replied without hesitation. "And you're talking like a civilian." In that moment, I made a choice that went against everything I'd been trained to do, everything I'd been taught to value. I looked at my father, this man who'd shaped my entire understanding of honor and duty and service, and I chose betrayal. Not of my country, not of my oath, but of the machine that had ground my sister into classified dust and was now reaching for her child. I acted like I was following orders. I nodded to my father, handed him my service weapon as a gesture of submission, and walked away from the pier carrying the baby. But instead of taking the child to whatever facility Dad had arranged, whatever black site where inconvenient truths went to disappear, I used my SEAL training for a different kind of operation, Operation Safe Haven. I drove across 3 state lines, cutting communications, destroying tracking devices, using every evasion technique I'd learned in counterintelligence training. For the first time in my career, I was the asset going dark, and the feeling was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. I was betraying everything I'd sworn to protect, and I'd never felt more like a true soldier. The Veterans Clinic in Portland was a place I'd heard about through unofficial channels, a facility that asked no questions and kept no records for military personnel who needed help they couldn't get through official channels. When I walked in carrying the infant, still wearing my soaked dress blues, the triage nurse looked at me with the kind of professional compassion that comes from seeing too much trauma. "Ma'am, whose baby is that?" she asked gently, preparing a bassinet with practiced efficiency. "Mine," I said, and felt something unclench in my chest that years of combat had never touched. It was the first truth I'd spoken in months, and saying it felt like breaking surface after being underwater for too long. "His name is Noah. He needs medical attention, and I need him to be safe." For 6 weeks, I went underground. I used cash, avoided military installations, and lived like a fugitive while Noah recovered from his ordeal. I learned to change diapers, to recognize different types of cries, to function on 3 hours of sleep split across a dozen interruptions. I learned that protecting someone who couldn't protect themselves was different from any mission I'd ever run, harder, more terrifying, but also more meaningful than anything I'd done in uniform. But Dad wasn't finished with his war against inconvenient truths. He filed a missing evidence report, escalating it to a Navy-level investigation. Suddenly, I was wanted for theft of classified materials, destruction of government property, and desertion. My face was on bulletin boards in every military installation on the West Coast. The machine I'd served faithfully for 8 years had declared me an enemy, and my father was the one who'd pulled the trigger. The manhunt lasted 3 months. They found me in a motel outside Seattle, feeding Noah a bottle while watching the news coverage of my own disappearance. The MPs were respectful but firm. I was being taken into custody pending a formal inquiry into my actions. As they cuffed me, I looked down at Noah sleeping peacefully in his carrier, and I knew I'd do it all again. The Inspector General's hearing became our courtroom, the place where 3 generations of family dysfunction would finally be dragged into the light. The hearing room was sterile, fluorescent, designed to drain all emotion from whatever truth it contained. Dad sat at the prosecution table in his dress uniform, every ribbon and decoration polished to perfection, looking like the poster child for military bearing. I sat across from him in civilian clothes, holding Noah because no one else would take responsibility for his care. The evidence unfolded like a war crime tribunal. Internal emails revealed the extent of Dad's surveillance on Claire. Medical records showed her pregnancy had been reported to military intelligence as a security concern. Financial documents proved that Marcus Rowan's career destruction had been systematic and deliberate. And then, the piece of evidence that changed everything: audio recordings from Claire's final week alive. My sister's voice filled the sterile hearing room, scared but determined. "I know what you're planning, Dad. I know about the transfer orders, about the medical facility. I won't let you disappear my child the way you disappeared me." There was a pause, then Dad's voice, cold and clinical. "Your choices have consequences, Lieutenant. The service doesn't accommodate personal indulgences." "This isn't an indulgement," Claire replied, her voice breaking. "This is my family. This is love." "Love," Dad said with contempt that carried clearly through the recording, "is a luxury we can't afford." The hearing room fell silent when the recording ended. Dad sat motionless, his face revealing nothing, but I could see the slight tension in his shoulders that meant his perfect composure was costing him everything he had. The panel of officers looked at him with expressions ranging from disgust to pity, and I realized they were seeing him the way I should have seen him years ago, not as a hero, but as a man so afraid of vulnerability that he'd kill his own daughter to protect himself from feeling it. When they called Dad to testify, he stood with military precision and delivered his statement like a mission briefing. "I acted within the scope of my authority to protect operational security." Lieutenant Hale's relationship with the foreign investigative journalist represented a clear and present danger to naval intelligence operations. Her pregnancy created additional security vulnerabilities that required immediate mitigation. I followed established protocols for handling compromised personnel. The lead investigator, a gray-haired admiral I recognized from intelligence briefings, leaned forward with barely controlled anger. "Admiral Hale, you're speaking about your daughter and grandson as if they were enemy combatants." "I'm speaking about them as security risks," Dad replied without hesitation. "Personal relationships don't change professional obligations." "And what about paternal obligations?" the investigator pressed. "What about the obligation to protect your family instead of destroying them?" For the first time since I'd known him, my father hesitated. Just for a moment, just long enough for me to see the crack in his armor, the place where 30 years of compartmentalized grief was leaking through his military facade. "Family," he said slowly, "is a luxury that service members forfeit when they take their oath." That's when I stood up, Noah in my arms, and spoke the words that had been building in my chest for months. "You're wrong, Dad. You've been wrong about everything." My voice was steady, but I could feel tears starting, years of suppressed emotion finally breaking free. Family isn't something you forfeit for service. Family is what you serve to protect. Claire didn't betray her oath when she fell in love. You betrayed yours when you chose duty over humanity. The room was completely silent now, all attention focused on the confrontation that had been building since Claire first brought Marcus home for dinner. Dad looked at me with the same tactical assessment I'd seen him use on enemy combatants, and I realized he was seeing me as another security risk to be eliminated. Lieutenant Commander, he said formally, you're speaking from emotion, not analysis. Your sister's actions compromised. My sister's actions, I interrupted, my voice rising, were those of a woman trying to build a life with someone she loved. Your actions were those of a man so terrified of losing control that he murdered his own daughter to maintain it. The word murdered hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Dad's face went white, then red, then settled into the mask of controlled fury I'd seen him wear during the worst tactical briefings. Lieutenant Commander Hale, he said with deadly quiet, you will retract that statement immediately. No, sir, I replied, using his rank like a blade. I won't retract the truth. You killed Claire. Maybe not with your own hands, but you killed her just as surely as if you'd pulled a trigger. You destroyed her relationship, isolated her from her support system, and then disappeared her when she became inconvenient. And when she gave birth to evidence of your crimes, you tried to drown that too. The lead investigator was taking notes furiously, but I could see other panel members exchanging glances that meant they'd already reached their conclusion. Dad was finished, and he knew it. His career, his reputation, his legacy, everything he'd built over 3 decades of service was crumbling in real time. I did what I thought protected the service, he said finally, and for the first time, his voice carried something other than certainty. It might have been regret, or it might have been the recognition that his war against vulnerability had cost him everything he'd claimed to be protecting. You protected the silence that killed her, I said, holding Noah closer as he began to fuss. You protected a system that values obedience over humanity, control over love, order over family. And in protecting that system, you became the thing every service member swears to defend against, a tyrant who destroys what he can't control. The panel deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the lead investigator's expression was grim but resolved. Rear Admiral Thomas Hale, he said formally, this panel finds that your actions constituted gross misconduct, abuse of authority, and criminal negligence resulting in the death of Lieutenant Claire Hale and the attempted murder of an infant civilian. You are hereby stripped of rank, dismissed from service without honors, and recommended for criminal prosecution. Dad stood to receive the judgment with the same military bearing he'd maintained throughout the hearing, but I could see his hands shaking again, not with guilt this time, but with the recognition that everything he'd built his identity around was gone. As the MPs approached to escort him out, he looked at me one last time with an expression I couldn't read. It might have been hatred or disappointment, or the closest thing to love a man like him was capable of feeling. Elena, he said quietly, using my first name for the first time in years, you've chosen your side. Yes, sir, I replied. I've chosen family over fear, love over loyalty, truth over tradition. I've chosen to be the person Claire needed me to be, even if it's too late to save her. He nodded once, a gesture that might have been understanding or simply acknowledgement, and walked out of the hearing room still standing at attention. It was the last time I ever saw him. Months later, I transferred out of active duty and settled in a small coastal town 3 hours north of the base where I'd grown up. I took Noah, legally adopted him through a process that required testimony about his parentage, and raised him near the ocean, far from uniforms and orders and the machinery of institutional silence. The house I rented was small but bright, with windows that faced the water and walls painted in colors Claire would have loved. Mom visited in secret at first, bringing formula and baby clothes and the kind of unconditional forgiveness that only mothers seem capable of. She'd lost a husband and a daughter to the same war, but she refused to lose a grandson and another daughter to pride or politics. Your father was a good man who made terrible choices, she told me one afternoon while Noah napped in his crib. But that doesn't mean we have to keep making them. It took her 6 months to leave Dad officially, another year to finalize the divorce. When she moved in with Noah and me, she brought Claire's paintings and a trunk full of letters our sister had written but never sent, letters to Marcus, to the baby she was carrying, to the father who'd stopped seeing her as a daughter and started seeing her as a problem. Reading them was like holding Claire's heart in my hands, feeling the weight of dreams that had been classified as dangerous and love that had been declared a threat to national security. One day, about 18 months after the hearing, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words written in handwriting I recognized. For the child who should have never been classified. For the daughter who remembered what duty actually means. For the sister who chose love over loyalty and found a way to honor both. Attached was a foundation check for $50,000 made out to the Pacific Coast Veterans Family Services, established for children of discharged military mothers. Dad's name wasn't on the check or the paperwork. It didn't have to be. The signature on the bottom of the letter was just an initial, T, but I knew it came from a man trying to find a way to serve a different kind of mission. Over the following years, more checks arrived. Never with explanations, never with contact information, just quiet support for programs that helped military families navigate the space between service and humanity. Dad was fighting a different war now, one against the system he'd spent his career defending, and maybe that was his way of finding redemption. Noah grew up surrounded by water and stories about a mother he'd never met, but whose love shaped every day of his life. I told him about Claire's paintings, about her gentleness, about the way she'd seen beauty in things that couldn't be quantified or controlled. I told him about Marcus, about the courage it took to love someone whose family saw your honesty as a threat. And yes, I told him about his grandfather, not the monster who'd destroyed his parents, but the broken man who'd been so afraid of losing control that he'd sacrificed everything he claimed to be protecting. On the 5th anniversary of Claire's death, I took Noah to the pier where everything had changed. He was old enough now to understand some of the story, old enough to stand beside me at the water's edge and place a single medal on the waves, not one of Dad's military decorations, but the Purple Heart that had arrived in the mail the week before. No note attached. Families aren't missions, I said to the ocean, to Claire's memory, to the child who stood beside me holding my hand. They're people. And people deserve rescue, even when the threat comes from inside the walls we're supposed to trust. The wind carried my words out over the water, mixing them with the sound of waves and seagulls and the distant horns of ships that sailed toward horizons my sister had painted but never seen. Noah squeezed my hand and asked if Mommy Claire could hear us from heaven, and I told him the truth, that love doesn't disappear when people do, that the best way to honor the dead is to protect the living, and that sometimes the greatest act of service is refusing to follow orders. As we walked back from the pier, Noah chattering about the metal he'd watched sink into the waves, I felt something I hadn't experienced since diving into that dark water to save him peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. Claire was gone. Dad was gone. The family I'd grown up in was scattered like debris from an explosion. But the family I'd chosen, the family I'd fought for, the family I'd betrayed everything to protect, that family was walking beside me, asking questions about seagulls and wanting to know when we could come back to throw more medals into the ocean. The story doesn't end with justice, because there is no justice for a daughter who died protecting her right to love. It doesn't end with reconciliation, because some wounds are too deep for forgiveness to heal completely. It ends with choice, the choice to break cycles of silence, to value humanity over hierarchy, to remember that duty without compassion is just another word for tyranny. Every night, when I tuck Noah into bed in a room painted the color of Claire's favorite sky, I think about the box my father threw into the river. He meant it to be a burial, an ending, a final elimination of evidence that couldn't be controlled. Instead, it became a rescue mission, a beginning, a reminder that love is stronger than loyalty, and that some truths refuse to stay buried. Not all battles are fought overseas. Some are fought in hearing rooms and hospital corridors, in small coastal houses where children grow up safe from the wars their parents couldn't win. Some are fought by daughters who choose to save what their fathers tried to destroy, who learn that the highest form of service is protecting the vulnerable from those who claim to serve them. And sometimes, if you listen carefully to the sound of waves against the shore, you can hear the echo of a woman's voice saying what she never got the chance to say in life. That love is not a luxury, vulnerability is not a weakness, and family is not something you forfeit for service. It's something you serve to protect, even when the cost is everything you thought you knew about honor.